Welcome to The Explainer. You know, if you've ever thought that historical religious texts are just these boring collections of stories about pristine, absolutely flawless individuals, well, you're in for a fascinating surprise today. We're going to explore how the biblical narrative actually relies on a totally different premise. It presents a perfect God working through some deeply, deeply flawed human beings. Instead of sweeping the failures of its main characters under the rug, the text puts them right front and center. Murderers, traitors, and yeah, persecutors. When we strip away the centuries of stained glass windows and sanitized folklore, the source material reveals the genuinely shocking pasts of some of history's greatest figures. We are talking about individuals who made devastating mistakes, who actively rebelled, and who carried massive burdens of guilt. According to the text, these weren't just minor slip-ups. These were life-shattering crimes that, honestly, by all logic, should have completely disqualified them from any kind of spiritual leadership. So, what does this all mean? It really boils down to the core concept we're unpacking today, and that is redemption. The text frames redemption as a state where your past failures do not define your future, but rather they become the very testimony of transforming grace. In this explainer, we're going to look at several incredible case studies from the source material. We'll see exactly how heavy guilt and devastating choices were completely rewritten by divine mercy. So let's dive into our first subject. Take Moses. Long before he was known as the legendary deliverer who parted the Red Sea, the text tells us Moses was a fugitive running from a horrific crime. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, sure, but he witnessed the abuse of his Hebrew people, and in his sudden fit of rage, he murdered an Egyptian. He literally buried the body in the sand to hide his guilt. Yet, this is the exact same man who would eventually establish a covenant that shaped biblical history for generations. How in the world do we get from a fugitive hiding in the sand to a legendary deliverer? Let's trace that exact journey. After years of absolute privilege in the palace, one single fatal day of anger leads to murder. And then, for 40 long years, Moses lives in exile. He flees to the wilderness in absolute fear, living as a total nobody, just an unknown shepherd. For 40 decades, it seemed like his future was entirely destroyed by that one terrible decision. But then, a single moment changes everything. He's called from a burning bush that miraculously never burns up. God calls this fugitive to return to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, and deliver his people. 40 years of hiding, completely undone by one encounter. Moving right along, our next case study is King David. Now, here is a monarch who literally had everything a person could possibly desire. He was powerful, successful, trusted by his people, yet his heart wandered, and that led to calculated, terrible sins, adultery with Bathsheba, and then arranging the deliberate death of her husband, Uriah, just to cover up his own wrongdoing. It's a staggering abuse of power. So how does a man responsible for all of this ultimately get remembered by the source text as a man after God's own heart?
Well, the transition for David wasn't automatic. He didn't just ignore his crimes and move on. He followed a very specific path of sincere repentance. First off, confrontation. When the prophet Nathan called him out, David didn't harden his heart or, just execute the messenger. Second, genuine sorrow. He felt the true, crushing weight of his actions. Third, heartfelt confession, which is actually preserved historically in Psalm 51, widely recognized as one of the most profound ancient texts on seeking forgiveness. And finally, divine restoration. The text notes he definitely faced painful consequences, but he was restored because he continually returned to God in absolute humility. This brilliantly illustrates our next figure, Rahab. Talk about a striking juxtaposition. Here is a Jericho outcast, working as a prostitute. She lived a life that placed her entirely outside the traditional expectations of holiness or religious purity. Yet, her ultimate legacy? An honored ancestor? She is explicitly named in the biblical genealogy as part of the family line that eventually leads directly to Jesus Christ. So how exactly did she get there? When Israelite spies entered her city, Rahab recognized the true God. She took a massive, incredibly calculated risk to her own life to hide those spies and help them escape. Because of that bold action, she saved her entire family from the fall of Jericho, and she was woven directly into salvation history. The text uses her story to drive home a huge point. An individual's faith in the present, not the heavy baggage of their past, is what dictates their future. Okay, moving forward, we encounter perhaps the most dramatic psychological and spiritual pivot in the entire source material.
To the early Christians, Saul of Tarsus represented pure terror. He truly believed he was serving God by actively arresting believers, approving of executions like the stoning of Stephen, and trying to just systematically wipe out the early church. Yet this is the very same man who becomes Paul the Apostle, the absolute greatest missionary of the early church, and the guy who would go on to write a massive portion of the New Testament.
How does a religious terrorist become an apostle? The text points to a singular, blinding encounter on the road to Damascus. Jesus asks him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" In that sudden moment of brilliant, blinding light, Saul realizes he's been fighting against the very Messiah he thought he was defending. The enemy literally becomes the preacher. It's a profound narrative showing us that, in the text's view, grace is infinitely stronger than any past rebellion.
Which brings us to a totally different kind of failure. We're not talking about calculated murder or zealous persecution here, but sudden, crushing cowardice. Peter was famous for his bold, loud, passionate devotion. Yet, on the night of Christ's arrest, he was completely overwhelmed by fear, denying he even knew Jesus 3 separate times. But this fearful denier, he's the exact same man who would soon stand up as a courageous leader, powerfully preaching to thousands of people.
Let's map out this incredibly rapid fall and rise. First, the night of the arrest and the denial. Then, the very next morning. The rooster crows, Peter remembers the warning, and the text says he wept bitterly. It's a moment of total psychological collapse. Most people would assume his calling is forever ruined, right? But look at post-resurrection. Beside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus lovingly asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Each question intentionally erases one of those 3 denials, perfectly restoring his purpose, so that just weeks later, he's out there boldly preaching at Pentecost. For our final case study, the text presents a real extreme edge case. A condemned criminal hanging on a cross, initially mocking Jesus right along with everyone else. This guy has absolutely 0 time left on the clock. He can't perform any good works, he can't build a better reputation, he literally cannot change his earthly life. Yet, he becomes a forgiven believer in his final moments, all because he simply recognized his guilt and asked to be remembered. And the response he receives is captured in this massive, world-altering promise: "Today you will be with me in paradise." This is the text's ultimate argument right here. Divine grace requires absolutely no prerequisites of time or future good deeds. It remains fully available until a human being's absolute last breath. So looking back at this wide array of individuals, we really have to ask ourselves, what did all these broken people actually share? I mean, they came from completely different backgrounds, they committed vastly different sins, ranging from momentary cowardice to premeditated murder, and they lived in entirely different generations. The text provides one life-changing truth. They all encountered mercy. The source material argues that the greatest miracle in its pages isn't the flashy cinematic stuff. It's not the parting of the Red Sea, and it's not even the raising of the dead. The greatest miracle is the fundamental transformation of a human heart. The text insists that God doesn't search for flawless people. Instead, he specializes in rewriting broken stories. Let's visually stack the evidence of this transforming power by summarizing what we've covered today. Just look at this incredible roster of flawed characters. Moses, a fugitive who ended up leading a nation. David, a murderer who became the archetypical repentant king. Rahab, a societal outcast woven directly into royal lineage. Paul, the ultimate enemy who became the primary apostle. Peter, the fearful denier who transformed into a courageous leader. And the thief, saved at the absolute final breath. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from today's explainer. No one is beyond grace. The source material presents these individuals not just as dry historical footnotes, but as living testimonies meant to prove that forgiveness is real and that shattered lives can be entirely repurposed. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating narrative. I'll leave you with a deeply provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up. If these heavily flawed individuals could be transformed and utilized for such massive historical purpose, what does that mean for the rest of us?